Tonight we begin with a development that U.S. officials had feared, anticipated, and quietly prepared for. A confrontation that unfolded not over weeks, but in hours. Hours that changed the dynamic on the ground. Hours that forced Washington into action. Hours that revealed just how close we are to something bigger. What Putin did today crossed the line that the Biden administration had hoped would hold. And when that line broke, Ukraine did not hesitate. They responded with precision, speed, and overwhelming force. For months now, there had been signals, not official statements, not diplomatic cables, just signals that Putin was preparing something unprecedented. Putin has been aggressive, yes, but he has been calculated in his aggression. His moves have followed a certain rhythm, a predictability, almost a pattern. But what set off alarm bells in Washington this week was that the pattern went silent. Intelligence analysts who monitor Russian military activity know the indicators. The troop movements near the border, the encrypted communications between commanders, the repositioning of strategic assets, the sudden halt in diplomatic engagement, all of that went quiet. And whenever Putin goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. Early Wednesday morning, U.S. intelligence detected what they described as unusual military positioning, including nuclear-capable aircraft that had not been activated in over 18 months. These are the kinds of assets that Russia only deploys when they are signaling something very specific: escalation, deterrence, or provocation. Observers didn't know which category this fell into or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that Putin was changing posture. And when a nuclear power shifts posture without explanation, even by small degrees, Washington pays attention. The warning issued by the White House tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Officials, after emergency briefings, described Putin's move as destabilizing, provocative, and, perhaps most importantly, calculated to test American resolve. But intimidation only works if the target hesitates. Ukraine did not. In fact, their response today was among the most decisive we've seen in this conflict. Here's what we know. Within 6 hours of Putin's threat, Ukraine launched a coordinated strike deep into Russian-held territory. These weren't the limited operations we've seen before. These were precision attack systems that Ukraine only deploys when they are preparing to change the battlefield entirely. Tonight, Ukrainian officials confirmed that their forces launched drone and missile strikes on military installations, including a command center that had recently been reinforced for what analysts believe was a major offensive push. Ukraine struck before Russia could mobilize. They hit ammunition depots. They hit logistics hubs. And wretched, they hit communication towers that were likely preparing to coordinate ground advances. In other words, Ukraine targeted the nervous system of Russia's forward operations, the infrastructure that would have made the offensive operational. This is what made Washington's warning so urgent. Putin's threat wasn't just symbolic, it was actionable. It represented the kind of move that could destabilize the entire region if left unchecked. And Ukraine, understanding that fully, responded with force. Not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't target civilian areas. They didn't escalate beyond military objectives. They hit command infrastructure. They hit supply lines. And here's where the story becomes even more significant. U.S. intelligence officials now believe that Putin's latest move was designed to test the unity of Western support after months of political debate. Putin wanted to see whether Ukraine would hesitate, but instead, the opposite happened. Ukraine didn't wait for approval. They launched a response that was so swift, so coordinated, that even the Kremlin noticed. You don't get Putin's attention easily, but today, Ukraine did. Military analysts speaking with major outlets under anonymity described Putin's shift as posturing, a way to project strength while buying time. But Ukraine proved today that they remain both capable and unpredictable. Their strikes were not only effective, they were timed so precisely that Russian forces had no chance to respond. As reports continued coming in throughout the evening, we learned more about the scale of Ukraine's response. Ukrainian air forces carried out over 40 sorties, forcing Russian air defenses into retreat. Ground units targeted fuel depots that had been established in the last 2 weeks. Special operations forces, operating behind enemy lines, reportedly disabled radar systems used by Russia to coordinate drone attacks. This wasn't just defense. This wasn't just retaliation. This was operational dominance. This was battlefield initiative. And battlefield initiative is the one thing Russia has struggled to maintain since this conflict began. For every advance they have made, Ukraine has countered with something that forces them backward. Remember, Putin thought Ukraine would collapse in days. He thought Western support would fade after the first winter. He thought economic pressure would break European resolve. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Ukraine is stronger, Western alliances are unified, and Russia is increasingly isolated. What makes this moment so critical and so dangerous is that Putin's latest move happened at a time when he is under enormous internal pressure. Hardliners want total escalation. Oligarchs want economic stability. Military commanders want more resources. The Russian public wants an end to the conflict. Putin is balancing these demands while losing ground on the battlefield. And when leaders in that position make sudden moves, they're not doing it from strength. They're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from vulnerability. The White House's statement, now circulating across diplomatic channels, was designed to signal that Washington is not willing to tolerate further escalation. Officials said plainly that Putin's actions were inconsistent with any path toward resolution. That is diplomatic language for, we see what you're doing and we're prepared to act. You don't usually hear that tone from this administration unless something serious is at stake. Meanwhile, Ukraine's President Zelensky addressed his nation in a defiant, resolute speech tonight. He said, "We do not seek war, but we will never accept surrender." He said, "Every threat from Moscow strengthens our determination." And he said, "Ukraine stands not alone, but with the free world." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a nation that understands just how high the stakes have become. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Putin's latest move wasn't isolated. Along with his direct threat to Washington, Belarus also mobilized troops near the Polish border. Russian cyber units launched attacks on European infrastructure. State media increased propaganda targeting NATO unity. All of this happened within the same 48 hours. When Putin moves multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. Analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Putin is preparing for a winter offensive. Another is that Putin is attempting to fracture Western support before elections. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Putin is testing whether nuclear threats will create hesitation. But today, Ukraine took that card off the table. They didn't wait. They didn't negotiate. They didn't show fear. They responded with force. What we're watching now is a test of resolve. Putin wants to see whether threats can break alliances. Ukraine wants to show that strength is the only language Moscow understands. Washington wants to prevent further escalation, and Europe wants to prevent a wider war. Tonight, we've heard from Pentagon officials who are now monitoring Russian movements closely. They say no immediate nuclear threat has been detected. They say Ukraine's strikes significantly degraded Russian capabilities. And they say Putin's decision to threaten Washington directly is likely part of a broader strategy intended to divide public opinion. But Ukraine is not backing down. In fact, Ukraine is pressing forward. Their response today, swift, precise, and devastating, sent a message to Putin that intimidation will not work. And it sent a message to Washington that their ally remains strong. As the night goes on, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Putin hoped to achieve. But what we do know is that Washington's warning was timely. It reinforced alliance commitments, it signaled resolve, and it gave Ukraine the confidence to act. What happens next will depend on what Putin does in the next 72 hours. If he escalates further, this moment will be remembered as a turning point. If he retreats, Ukraine and Washington have already shown they are ready. They have shown they are ready to respond. And tonight, for the first time in months, Putin appears to be recalculating. The Kremlin is quiet, too quiet. And when Putin is quiet, it means he is thinking. It means he is choosing his next move carefully. Because tonight, Putin learned something he has learned many times before. Threats without follow-through weaken credibility. Ukraine cannot be intimidated, and Washington will not abandon its allies. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear. Ukraine remains defiant, Washington remains committed, and Putin remains dangerous. And we will be here watching every detail as the next phase unfolds.